Thanks for joining us again this week on this edition of IPWatchdog Unleashed. Today, we're going to have a conversation with Corey Salsberg, who's Vice President and Global Head of IP Affairs for Novartis, which is one of the world's leading and most innovative biopharmaceutical companies. We're going to talk about the issues that are in play and that matter for the pharmaceutical world. We're going to talk about IP generally, and we're going to talk about really whatever it is Corey wants to talk about. Corey, thanks for being here. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Sure, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So I know we had a little conversation before we started recording here, and there has been a lot going on in the world, just generally speaking, and also with respect to IP as well. So where do you want to lead off today?
Yeah, thanks, Gene. So I always like to ground these conversations in things that are accessible to the everyday person who's not in the IP watchdog world. You know, I mean, we have a great IP community here, but IP matters for people in their daily lives. And, you know, it's been a sad week, I think, for Americans that grew up in the 70s and 80s like myself, and I'm sure you as well, Gene. Yeah. We've had 3 prominent celebrity deaths. Malcolm Jamal Warner was the star of The Cosby Show that a lot of us grew up with. Ozzy Osbourne of Black Sabbath and an amazing solo career. And, of course, most recently Hulk Hogan. And I was starting, you know, a lot of people have been talking about this, these bad things come in threes, all that kind of thing. But I was reflecting a little bit on the IP stories of each of these people and the different entities and enterprises that they affected. And if you think about it, I mean, starting with copyright, right? I mean, television absolutely depends on copyright, broadcast rights, but copyright goes hand in hand with that. You've got The Cosby Show, you've got, WWE and all the wrestling that I know I grew up with and loved as a kid. So there's copyright there, the music side, right? I mean, copyright is instrumental to the music industry and musicians. If it weren't for the system, you wouldn't have people like Ozzy Osbourne, making a career out of that. Trademarks, I mean, you think about WWE and all the things that Hulk Hogan was involved with how important trademarks are, to industries like that, and even patents. So I looked this up. I was wondering, I know, other celebrities like Eddie Van Halen famously have all kinds of patents on their actual, guitar modifications. Hulk Hogan, it turns out, does not have any patents himself, as far as I could tell, which, maybe those who don't like some of the 101 reforms would be happy about that because you can't patent wrestling moves and things like that. But you actually can patent action figures that resemble Hulk Hogan. Hasbro has a patent there. And then maybe a little more seriously, the other patent story here, I think, is one of the factors, I'm sure, I think yet to be determined, but Ozzy Osbourne suffered from Parkinson's disease. And this is one of those diseases that scientists and companies like ours, right, I mean, and other peer companies, thanks to the patent system, we can have scientists who spend their time, their full careers in laboratories that are well-funded so they can research and try to find treatments and cures for diseases like this. So, again, I mean, it's kind of a light, I think, tribute to the patent system and the broader IP system in the scheme of the current events that have happened this week. But again, I think it's really important to ground these discussions in why should the average American care about a strong IP system, because it brings us all of these kinds of amazing things that enhance our lives.
Yeah, and the right of publicity with the name, image, and likeness. People think about that today because of the college sports, because particularly football and basketball, college athletes are not getting paid. But for folks particularly like Hulk Hogan and Ozzy, those are big deals, and I think they're going to become much more important moving forward as you have AI. I know that there is, I think it was, there's a country star. I won't say his name because I can't remember exactly, but there is a country star who had trouble singing anymore. Had some vocal problems, but he still wanted to put out new music, and he wrote new stuff and then ran his voice as it was once upon a time through this AI to sing his songs, his new songs. So yeah. It's a brave new world with innovation and technology and the intersection of intellectual property.
I think just to respond to that, I think there's pros, like all technology, right? There's pros and cons to that. I think on the pro side, another example that I remember seeing, I think in the last year or so, the Beatles released an unreleased track where they were able to kind of use John Lennon's voice, late John Lennon, right? And add that to a track that should have been released or would have been released, I guess. So that's a positive thing is as long as it has a consent, I think, of the estate and also the other Beatles in that case. But you also have the potential for abuse here and the potential to displace, I think, those stars that have and talented people that actually have the privacy rights in their own voice and likeness. And that's why you have things like the No Fakes Act and others that have been introduced to try to create global or across the country, at least national rights in one's likeness in order to prevent the unauthorized use of that without consent. Because you can imagine a world where it's pretty easy using AI today where people are sampling and copying, a famous star's voice or likeness for a film, right? And then suddenly you're displacing the opportunities for those talented humans to actually do the work. So I think we need the balance, right? I think there's great just like any technology, like I said, great applications, but also potential for abuse that we have to watch out for.
Yeah, it's always amazed me that it has not been a national standard for a right of publicity. We used to call it right of publicity. Now everybody calls it name, image, likeness. Yeah. But because in Tennessee, I can tell you for sure nothing happens that Elvis's estate doesn't want. But Tennessee is not every state. Their laws are very, think of it, most people who don't know this area think, oh, Tennessee,
Sure.
It would be New York or California. Well, they have developed laws too, but if you're a performer and you have an identifiable voice, the place for you to be, load up the truck and move to Tennessee.
And you got Nashville too, right? And Memphis and Nashville.
Yeah,
so, sure.
and Tennessee matters because that's where Elvis grew up and that's where his estate is, and so the laws have grown up there with Elvis in mind, really, and protecting really a national icon, but certainly a state treasure.
Right.
So it is very interesting that intellectual property touches so many lives, and it is sad to see when the people that we grew up. And Renee was just been commenting on this. It seems like more and more that this is happening. And I don't know whether you've had this moment yet or not, but as these people are passing away, like Hulk Hogan, 71 years old, Malcolm Jamal Warner, 54. I mean, he's exactly my age.
Yeah.
But Hulk Hogan at 71, Ozzy at 76, that seems a lot younger than what it did to me, 10, 20 years ago. And the older I get, the more I want and need, drugs, treatments, therapies, modalities, call it whatever you will. But, and this is probably the conversation I thought we were maybe going to have. Sure. Not that this wasn't big, and I could riff all day on this stuff because I think it's very interesting how intellectual property and innovation touch life. It permeates our life. But the one place where it has not permeated decision-making the way that I thought it would once upon a time is in the pharmaceutical sector. I thought having an old and continuously getting older Supreme Court would lead them to make different decisions, and I go back to the Mayo and Myriad case. I thought back then, and now those are approaching 15 years old, not quite 15, probably 12 years old, 12, 13 years old. I thought back then that an aging Supreme Court was going to see the importance of patent eligibility and want better treatments, better cures, better drugs, and that didn't play out, and I've had this conversation with people. It's like maybe it's not for them; they don't see it for them, but you would think that they would have kids and grandkids that have issues, or friends and family who have kids and grandkids, and who wants to see children suffer? I mean, I don't think we do enough in the law to encourage. We have the Orphan Drug Act, but I think we need to be doing more.
Yeah.
And I know there's a lot on the table, so just pick whatever piece you want.
I'll just jump in that big picture issue. I mean, I share your your disappointment that those cases continue not to go that way, that Congress continues not to focus on the positive side of IP as much as they should on these issues. I think it's largely a lack of in some cases a lack of education, in some cases a lack of appreciation for how instrumental IP is to these things, right? That's why I started where I did, even though, of course, it's not our field directly. But people just take for granted, I think, the IP that operates in the background to produce the things that we actually want and that enhance our lives, and that includes medicines. And I think that, I mean, no one's sitting around saying, how can I make sure that we don't have any more innovative pharmaceuticals, right? I mean, everyone wants the pharmaceuticals. They want, those who develop those drugs and invent them and produce them and are pushing the limits of modern medicine to keep doing that. I think the problem is we have a bit of a misunderstanding about the roles of industry versus the government, for example, where the government, there's a false narrative out there that the work that the NIH does is what's responsible for drugs, when in fact that's upstream basic science that does actually open doors and pathways for drug developers to come in and come up with new ways to treat disease. But they're not actually working on the drug development itself and figuring out how to drug a druggable target. So there's that kind of misunderstanding. And I think there's also just kind of this false assumption that it doesn't matter if we weaken our IP laws, if we have price controls, if we restrict industry in other ways, the drugs will still keep coming anyway. I think is the false belief that a lot of people have. They just take for granted, I think, that we're going to continue having the levels of innovation that we've had. And I think there's a lot of that. Of course, there's also the politics, right? I mean, there's the long-term versus short-term. Same reason why, people, I think everyone agrees that we don't want to cut down the Amazon rainforest. We all care about the environment at that level, but tell that to a farmer who's trying to feed his family, off of the Amazon land, right now. I mean, that's a hard trade-off. So I think we all have a tendency as humans to kind of avoid the long-term conversations, right, and the long-term benefits and impact of our decisions in favor of the short-term. And that's what we see with the trade-off between drug pricing and the investment in innovation. In the short term, it's easy for I think those who want to lower drug prices to say, let's not worry about the future, let's worry about the now. But then the future catches up with us, to your point about us getting older.
Yeah, and there's so much in what you just said. I mean, because it's like fingers on the chalkboard to me, because I get so frustrated that people don't get it. I mean, there's a role for government-funded research, and that role is to do the stuff that industry couldn't possibly justify. It's speculative. And along the way, you fund universities to do that, and these great PhD minds in the labs are teaching the next generation, and they're learning a lot as they go along. They learn what doesn't work, which is, Edison pointed out, is just as valuable as learning what does work. And it works great from an educational standpoint, and every once in a while they come up with something that nobody could have possibly imagined, right? And then they turn it over, and it's nowhere near ready for the marketplace. They got to turn it over for somebody like in the life sciences area, a pharmaceutical company that's going to do the onerous work to not only figure out the targets, not only figure out how to actually dose this, but then figure that out enough so that it goes through stage 0, 1, 2, and 3 and get final approval at the FDA, which can take 10 to 15 years.
Yep.
And that's if you go in a linear way. I mean, if there's a hiccup and you have to reset, I mean, a lot of times those drugs that have a hiccup don't ever go anywhere, because... Yeah. But, I mean, so there's that. It's just frustrating, which is, I think, fundamentally the problem, not just in this space, but people just think that innovation is going to happen.
Yeah.
And it irritates the hell out of me when I have people say that, sometimes they won't tell me, but I know that that's what they believe. And because people know I get so upset when I say, because it's like, would you just work your job, whoever's paying your salary, whatever check you're getting, whether it's hourly, salary, would you go to work tomorrow if your boss said, you know what, really love having you around, but I can't pay you anymore?
Right.
No, of course you wouldn't. Of course you wouldn't. Nobody would. You wouldn't do it in a capitalist country. You wouldn't do it in a communist country. Why? Because you got to put food on the table for your family. You have to have the lights on. You have to have 4 walls. Yeah, it's got to be secure enough for them to live, and all the things that we need, not want, but the things that we need, shelter, food, that sort of thing, requires some resources. So people innately understand that themselves. But then somehow innovators all of a sudden, oh, well, that's what you do. You can't do anything else because you're an innovator. Innovators innovate. Well, they can't do anything else. That's where the mistake is.
Yep.
Yes, you could. And I always used to use this example when I was teaching in law school, is I like Van Gogh. I find his art beautiful. I wish he produced more. Now, if Van Gogh were around today and we didn't have a developed copyright system, it was a patronage system, he'd produce probably a lot less because he'd have to spend time finding patrons. And if we didn't even have that, then Van Gogh would have to be flipping burgers at McDonald's to make ends meet and then painting as a side project or a side gig, and we get a lot less. And look, if there are better systems out there that will produce more of what we want, great. I don't know what they are because there's no evidence that anything other than this capitalist model that we follow produces more, because every other model produces less. And there's some things where it's nice to have art, it's nice to have music, it's nice to have trademarks so you can identify, I like that product, not that product, but it's necessary to live, and we have the ability to live longer. We have the ability to treat more. We have the ability to cure more. So why the hell is government getting in the way?
Yeah, well, it's what Lincoln said, right? I mean, the patent system puts the fuel of interest on the fire of genius.
Right.
I'm paraphrasing, something like that.
Yeah, no, but why? So, I mean, I know, and you're head of IP policy, right? That's your job.
Yep.
So you have these conversations a lot, I'm sure. Have you been able to figure out what leads somebody to believe that innovation is just going to happen versus somebody who, in my words, not to put words in your mouth, but somebody who gets it, who understands that's not true? What's the disconnect?
I think, again, a lot of it's education. I think we starting at the foundations, right? I mean, I always go back to, it surprises most people when you tell them that the patent system, the copyright system are part of our Constitution, right? Our founders understood this from day one of this country. It was, I think, the third thing that the very first Congress did was pass the first Patent Act after the Constitution was ratified. They understood this, and I think at that point in time, they didn't have the option of taking it for granted, because you had a young country that really needed to find a way to survive on its own, and this was an important component of the economy back then. They realized right away that we need to actually get every talented innovator and creator that we have in this country working. It was already a self-sufficient, really innovative bunch who was living in the frontier in those days. So they harnessed all that, but I think over time, we stopped teaching that. I think people don't, we don't teach the constitutional basis. We don't teach patent law, even in law school. We don't teach IP law unless you opt for it. It's an optional course.
How is that possible? I mean, with all the people that are employed, the trillions of dollars a year it brings in, how is that not required in both business school and in law school?
Yeah, it's amazing that it's not. I think it's something like 90% of the value of the S&P 500 has an IP tie, something like that, or the statistic. We don't teach it. I was actually encouraged a little bit. I was recently speaking to someone who's in a business school, and they were talking about how they are teaching IP at a high level, at least, as one of the core components of how you run a business and how important it is. So there are pockets, but I think that we just don't have the organized appreciation anymore. And then, of course, I mean, to be fair, there's also this understandable tension between, we want to innovate, we want to create important products like medicines, but we also do want to find ways to make sure that those innovations get to the people who benefit from them. Mm-hmm. In our case, that's patients. We do what we can all over the world, not just in the United States, to try to get our drugs to as many people as possible, and we also try to get them to people at a price that makes sense, and that includes, of course, systems that take care of that. No one is expected to pay for these things fully out of pocket. That's not the way the system is supposed to work. And the idea is, of course, to use insurance systems, to use governments, and to use all different payer systems to make that possible. So that goes hand in hand with innovation. Then, of course, there's the life cycle that people forget about of innovation, right? Things like really the patent system is I'd focus on, because copyright term is so long, relatively speaking, although even there you've got that public domain on the back end, which is why we can all, appreciate Mozart today and play it at will without worrying about copyrights. Right. But on the medicine side, Gene, I know you know this figure, but just to remind the audience, I mean, the average drug, despite the narratives that we hear all the time, gets about 13 years before it faces generic competition, which is not very long. We have other drugs, some of our biggest selling drugs, at Novartis, for example, Entresto, our drug that is likely to come off patent sometime this year or soon, that's going to end up getting something like 10 years, right? So 13 is the average. And there's a ton of investment that goes into these drugs. The average cost, across the board in our industry is about $2.6 billion and up. I think that's an old figure now. It's risen since then, like the cost of everything else. Yep. As you said before, it takes 10 to 15 years, 88% failure rate along the way. So, you're relying on these few successful drugs to fuel the rest. So built into that, though, is the expectation that eventually these drugs, and it's not even eventually, right? 13 years on average is when those drugs go generic. They become a lot cheaper at that point because generic companies, by design, don't actually invest in the R&D. They just copy, the successful products later on, and that actually opens it up at cheaper prices for more people to be able to access it at cost savings. And that's part of the system too, and that's what people forget, I think, on this narrative about not appreciating IP. Every single drug in existence today, 90% of which are generic in the United States, started their lives as patented innovative drugs that began with a patent system. So it's all part of the same life cycle, part of the different sides of the business. And without that system, you'd have none of it.
See, but there you go, interjecting facts into a religious conversation, right? Because if people actually cared about the facts, we'd be doing different things. I mean, look at the World Health Organization. What they have done, and I think that this makes a lot of sense, they have come out with 400, I think it's around 405, 410 essential drugs. These are the essential drugs in the world. Okay. 98% of them were at one point in time patented. Almost all of them are no longer patented.
Correct.
So the most essential drugs ever created by man, or virtually all at one point in time patented, and they are also now virtually all available to be in generic form. I mean, the patent system has worked. It's not a failure. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. And I always tell people, when you feel the worst and you go to the doctor, the prescription you're going to get, you take it to, it's going to be the smallest bill that you have, right? Because when you get like bronchitis or pneumonia or some things like this, it feels like you've just been repeatedly hit over the head and about the body with a baseball bat.
Yep.
And anybody who's had a severe bout of any of those or there's many other diseases, but those are two. You go there, you're going to get antibiotics for probably the full course is going to be under $5, and you're going to feel better. It'll feel like you're going through hell between now and then, but you're going to be fine, unless you're older and you have some other issues, in which case then pneumonia, for example, can be life-threatening. But for most people, you're going to feel like crap. You're going to take cheap drugs to get better, and it's because somebody else at some point in time paid the innovator for that drug, and we pay it forward. I mean, we get this idea of paying it forward. We always want our kids to be better off than we were.
Sure.
But the older I get, so much of this, it's just platitudes and BS is what it is. Because if you really had that kind of viewpoint, your policy towards drug development, for example, and IP more generally, would be different. Because you do get the benefit. And we get benefit, right? But our kids and grandkids get a lot of benefit. And I don't almost know what to say.
Well, I think the other thing that right in line with that point is the savings to the healthcare system that medicines provide, in addition to to just the medicines making you feel better, all of that. The alternative for a lot of these diseases that the new medicines are treating would be to go to the hospital. Right. And I think, there's calculations, we've talked about this before, and maybe we'll talk about it later, in the context of IRA, with how many fewer drugs we're going to have over the next decade because of the price controls that are put in place under the IRA drug price negotiation program. And by some of the estimates, the healthcare system is actually going to lose about $51 billion in value or in lost savings over the next 10 years as a result of the losses of those drugs, because instead of treating those diseases with cost-effective drugs that eventually will be even more cost-effective as they go generic, you're not going to have those drugs. So those are diseases where people are going to have to continue to go to the hospital. The hepatitis C drugs are always a great example of that, right? I mean, people had some sticker shock, I think, to the prices of those drugs when they were released, 10 years ago or whatever it was now. But what they failed to consider or appreciate was that prior to this, these were one-time cures basically for these drugs. And prior to that, people were going to the hospital to have to be treated on a regular basis, at the cost of, I think, millions of dollars it was per patient over time. So when you think about the price of a drug, it's not just the price of the R&D that went into it, the risk, the failure rates, and the necessity of enabling innovators to be able to recoup investment on the few successes to offset and pay for the entire R&D system. It's also the overall value that these drugs are creating, not just for the individual patient, but for the healthcare system, that ought to be considered when we think about whether a price is fair or not.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point, because I think we've got the incentives exactly backwards. And I don't have any problem with biologics, and I don't have any problem with encouraging biologics. But biologics are the type of drug that ordinarily you don't give yourself at home. You've got to go somewhere. You might not need to go to the hospital, but you got to go to a clinic, or you have to go somewhere to your doctor's office, and you're going to be there for a while, and you're going to be getting these drugs, a lot of them, maybe many of them even, but you get them intravenously, right? And whereas a pill, you can take it home, the privacy of your own home. And as I understand it, I'd like you to talk to this if you could. The law is set up so that biologics get longer exclusivity than pills.
Yeah.
And is this what's referred to in the commercials as the pill penalty? Is that the pill penalty?
Yeah, so that's under the IRA. So yeah, I mean, two things, slightly different concept. One is how long there's exclusivity under the regulatory data scheme in this country. Biologics get 12 years. Small molecules, which we call new chemical entities, they get 5 years. Now, some of that is a historic relic. I mean, the 5 years, I think the U.S. was the first system in the world under the Hatch-Waxman Act when it was first enacted, in the 80s, that introduced this idea of data exclusivity, or regulatory data protection, as we call it. 5 years of exclusivity. It runs kind of simultaneously with patent protection, so you're not getting it as an add-on. It's kind of a backstop.
So that's sort of like if all goes wrong and you wind up, the patent blows up, or you get 5 years.
It has to be a medicine that's never been approved as a medicine before. So I'll give you an example. If you've got a compound that was known before but not used as a drug, one real world example of that is the very first antibiotic was a drug called Prontosil in the 1930s that was a chemical dye that was used for years as industrial chemistry. At that time in Germany, Bayer started experimenting on its entire library of industrial chemicals to check them for medicinal properties. Turns out that this drug that called Prontosil was the name they gave to it, was an effective antibiotic, first synthetic antibiotic, as opposed to like a penicillin or something. And that would not have been eligible for patent protection on the compound because it already existed. What Bayer at that time did, and this is another angle on the patent system, right? Why do we have patents on things like a new use? Bayer went ahead, as I understand it, and patented the use. And so there's reasons why we have different ways of protecting drugs. At that time, regulatory data protection didn't exist, but the idea there would be that if you had the 5 years and you had such a compound like that where you couldn't patent the actual molecule, you'd have a minimum of 5 years from the date of launch of the drug to recoup that investment. again, what's I want to make clear, that runs at the same. It starts at a different time, but if you've got patent protection going out 10 years past the time you launch a drug, and the data protection that goes 5 years from the launch of the drug, you're not getting 15, you're getting the 10.
Right.
Or if your patent were to be invalidated or non-existent, you'd get the 5. So that's how it works.
So generics can't come in any quicker than the 5.
With one exception, which is that if generics want to conduct their own clinical trials, they can, because this doesn't cover the product, it covers the data.
Well, they never do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, and there's reasons for that, but I mean, cost reasons. In some cases, there's probably some ethical reasons for that. You're not going to repeat a clinical trial that doesn't need to be done, for example. So, but the system allows for that. But at that time, 5 years was considered all right, and I don't know offhand, the whole history there. By the time the BPCIA, which is the biologics law, came into play, that was like 2010, 2011 period when it was enacted in the U.S., we were looking at biologics, which are much more complex. So at that time, looking at at what was happening with biologics, large molecules, right? The conventional thinking at the time, or I think that the facts at the time were that it was a 12-year period would be appropriate because of the relative additional complexity of biologics. What I think we've learned now, though, back to the point about the pill penalty, is that small molecules, like all other forms of technology, have continued to advance, and they've now become extremely complex. In some cases, way more complex than even large molecules, again, in some instances. So we've got a field, we're leaders in a field called radioligand therapies, which is basically where we attach a individual particle of radiation to an individual binder that attaches to a single cancer cell. So it's like, people have been talking about this for years, but now it's a reality. You can target with radiation at the cellular level cancer cells, which protects all the healthy tissue because you're only targeting, very, very narrowly that cancer cell. Amazing stuff for prostate cancer and other cancers.
That's like black magic. I mean, that's like unbelievable. That's like Harry Potter waving a magic wand.
When you think about chemotherapy, as everyone knows, I think, is the problem there. Like, it's radiation and it does kill the cancer, but it's always been a race to kill the cancer before you kill the patient.
So I don't know whether people really get that. I mean, I saw my mother go through it at the end of her life. And if you've ever lived that, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy, not dealing with it, but like watching someone you love go through that.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And we all have. Right?
And we all have, right. And because if you have seen that, and now we have the ability to actually do in a way that, like Isaac Asimov kind of wrote about, was the book he wrote where they injected into the blood cells in a little shrunken submarine, went up to cut out what was the problem in the veins, now we have procedures for that, right? But this kind of like super targeted was literally the myth of science fiction.
Yep.
And now it's reality. And it is a race. And my mother didn't win that race, and she finally, it got so bad she gave up after 3 rounds because it was likely to prolong her life. It wasn't likely going to save her life, and it just wasn't worth it.
But now we're able to, surgically, I mean, in the metaphorical sense, it's not surgery, right? It's a treatment, but surgically target the cancer cells only, right? And you're preserving the healthy tissue. These are huge advances. But by the definitions, the conventional definitions of the size of the molecule, this qualifies as a small molecule. So it's only getting, in the case of RDP, right, it's getting a lesser period than the biologics. The pill penalty actually comes in through the IRA, though. So this is, remember, the drug price negotiation program that the Biden administration enacted through Congress at the time under the Biden administration. This introduced the idea of it's price controls. I mean, it's not negotiation. Mm-hmm. It's price controls, plain and simple. The current administration has acknowledged that, actually, in the April executive order on drug pricing. It called it price controls.
But they're still using it, right?
They are still using it. We'll get to that in a minute. But just really quick on the pill penalty, that's something, and that same executive order actually did mention an interest in fixing this pill penalty. And what that is that for small molecules, at year 9 after a drug has been on the market under the IRA drug price negotiation program, at year 9 years on the market, that's when a price control comes into play for a small molecule drug. At 13 years, it comes into play for a biologic or a large molecule drug. And the problem there is, of course, because of the 4-year difference there, it's problematic now. It's a huge financial disadvantage because, again, you're relying on those few successful drugs that you have to kind of fund your entire global R&D programs. Mm-hmm. It disincentivizes companies from investing in small molecules because you can get an additional 4 years if you're going to treat the same disease with a large molecule. And that is not science, right? You're discouraging following the best possible science, regardless of how big the molecule is, in favor of following those molecules that are going to benefit most from the innovation incentives that policymakers have put in place. And it's a very real thing. And to go back to the beginning of our conversation, I mean, absolutely, companies and individuals alike, they respond to the incentives around them, to stimuli. We're living beings, and living beings are part of corporations and other entities, and we behave based on the stimuli in our environment, right? I mean, that's what the incentives are all about. We're trying to harness what motivates people in order to get to the right outcomes. And that's why we call it the pill penalty, because in general, the small molecules can be summarized as pills, even though they're not all pills, like, a lot of them still procedures these days, versus biologics, which are more kind of the traditional injectables, things like that. So they call it the pill penalty. It's something that we are really trying to fix because, again, it's really an arbitrary distinction these days. Historical artifact, not really, consistent with the science, and not really encouraging following the best science. And that's a real problem that we'd like to see fixed.
Yeah. There's a couple big issues I want to make sure we get to. One is the most favored nation pricing.
Yep.
Where do we stand with that at the moment? Because it was hot for a minute, and I think it's still lurking, but it's kind of fallen off the radar with a lot of the other stuff that's going on at the moment.
So it's still in play as far as we know. I mean, that's hasn't gone away. I'll give you some thoughts on that. I mean, one is I do think it's the wrong policy for two big reasons. One is, if you think about let me maybe explain for a minute what that is. I mean, it's basically the idea that the U.S. should pay the same price as other countries that are relatively well off. End of story. That simple version of most favored nation pricing is problematic. Number one, because if you think about what is the benchmark there, well, what's everyone else paying? You're completely discounting the value of innovation from that conversation, right? It's not asking why others are paying what they are, or whether the price as a starting point, is that price the right price, right? Is the current price of drug X a fair price or not? It's not asking those questions. It's just saying, what is everyone else paying? I think that's really, a disservice to the right policy discussion ought to be, what is the value that this drug provides, and therefore what is the right price based on that value? And that's not a conversation, unfortunately, that we have in this country, and I think we should. Putting that aside, though, the problem with the MFN kind of approach is that, again, it's not looking at the causes of, if we're paying more than other countries, which is true actually for a lot of drugs, we do pay more in the United States or spend more on a particular drug than we do elsewhere. There's two sides to that. One is, are we paying more than we should in the United States? And the answer, I think, is yes, and I'll explain why in a minute. The other side to that is, are other countries who are benefiting from these same innovations, because all pharmaceutical companies these days either are or strive to be global in terms of patient reach, are they paying enough overseas? And the answer to that is no, they're not. And there's a variety of reasons for that. So we can unpack those two things. The first, are we overpaying in the U.S.? I think that the American drug system is paying too much, but it's not because we're rewarding innovation too much. It's because of the system that unfortunately has evolved over the years of middlemen in our healthcare system. That's the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers, the insurers, and other people in the middleman chain in the drug supply distribution chain, who are taking 50 cents on every dollar that is spent in this country goes into the pockets of these middlemen, instead of to the innovators who are actually delivering the drug and inventing and developing and delivering and manufacturing the drug. 50 cents on the dollar, if you think about how amazing that is.
So half goes not to the person who created it, and not to the person who's selling it to you.
Yep.
It goes to somebody in between those two entities.
Yep.
Now, so lucrative is that? Obviously, it was 50%. I mean, you do the math. Everybody can do the math.
Yep.
So lucrative is that you've started seeing pharmacies like CVS get into that middleman.
But vertical integration.
Right. The middleman needs to go away. Because as I understand, we're the only country that has a middleman like that, right?
Yes. I mean, there are rebates in other countries, and I should say, I mean, I'm not an expert on all the pricing, but I, at a high level, I can talk about how the system works. But yes, I mean, there are rebates and things like that in other countries in other ways, but to my knowledge, we're the only country in the world that has this system of middlemen. I mean, historically, just to understand it, my understanding is this started in the 1960s when prescription drug benefits became part of the healthcare system. And I think, employers and insurers looked for a way to turn to these entities that started to be created to handle the negotiation and the provision of the prescriptions. That all makes sense. I think there's no problem with that aspect of it. The problem is that the pricing models over time have evolved such that these PBMs and all these other middle players rely on rebates from the drug manufacturer in order to make a living, and those rebate levels have grown and grown and grown over time. The other thing that, as I understand it, is the way they profit is from the spread pricing, where they are charging the insurer or the employer that they work for one amount, but then giving the pharmacy that actually dispenses the drug less. So they're kind of there's cuts all along the way in the spread there as well. So that is, I think, part of the system that is generating additional costs, again, 50 cents on the dollar when you add it all up, on drugs, which our industry believes ought to be a target for lowering drug prices in America, which would go a long way towards, I think, bringing down the versus the list price, the actual amount that people pay. The other aspect of this, I should say really quick, the other problem with it is that when patients pay their copay or their coinsurance, they are being, in many cases, charged a % of the list price of the drug, not the actual price that is ultimately being paid at the end of the day when you take out the rebates and all of this. So the out-of-pocket costs of Americans is inflated because of that formula as well. And then I'll let you respond, but we can also, I don't want to forget to talk about the international side too after, but go ahead.
It just feels like a scam to me, and it rubs me the wrong way. And I try and think of ways to explain this to like Joe Average, right? Who isn't. If you're a sports fan, you know that athletes, they have agents. The agents negotiate with the teams. They negotiate with brands who want to have them do endorsements and stuff. And the agents get a couple % of the overall deal. Mm-hmm. Now, these deals are gigantic. No agents that I know of are going hungry. They're extremely well paid and well compensated. I mean, you just look at what's going on in the NFL and the NBA. I mean, these people are getting like practically monopoly money, 50, 60, $70 million a year to either bounce a ball, carry a football, throw a football, catch a football. And their agents, they don't get 50%. If you were a lawyer, you couldn't ever charge 50%. It'd be unethical, right? And so we've created this sensible situation where I have a company. I don't know whether this should be included in our policy or not. We're going to have some other entity that specializes in this decide, does that particular drug fall within our plan? That makes sense. That's not worth 50% of the whole piece.
Yeah.
It's worth more, closer to like a sports agent, couple points, not 50 points.
So I actually looked up some studies, data, just again, I mean, I'm not an expert myself on this, but looked up how much money the PBMs are drawing out of the system. And some 2023 data suggests it's anywhere between 170 and $330 billion that year alone went to the PBMs in the value chain of how much is spent on.
Yeah, what I've seen is the 50% number is, it ranges what I've seen between 48 and 52%. It's half. It's half of what you pay is going to somebody who's literally in the middle, who didn't invent it and who isn't selling it to you. They're not stocking it. They're not selling. They don't have an establishment with employees where you can show up at, between 9 and 9 and pick up your script. These are just people who are sitting somewhere, God knows where, deciding, well, yes to that, no to this. I mean, and it's not to say that that's not work, but is that worth the biggest piece of a what is a $1 trillion industry? No, it's just not. Sane people don't think it is. It has to change, right? And I don't mind the most favored nation thing as much, because I think so much of what President Trump does is negotiating. He sets up negotiating positions, right? Because if the goal is to get the rest of the world to pay more, what can you do? I mean, so I think what he's trying to do is take a hard line and say, look, we're not going to pay any more than Germany or the UK or France. And because I do think it's a trade issue, because I think we could immediately overnight, if Congress had the will, reduce drug prices. Maybe not in half, because you probably still have somebody there in the middle, as we've talked about. But you could save people 40% easy without even trying, right? And then the rest of it, if you had the rest of the world pay at least something for the R&D that goes into the innovation that goes into these things, then you would reduce U.S. prices even more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the trick, right? Is to try to equalize those. Really quick before we talk about the international piece of it, which is what you're raising. The other big component for us that we'd like to see addressed is something called 340B, which is the hospital program. And what they do, hospitals, going back to I think early 1990s, there's a program where hospitals are able to purchase drugs at very low cost for, really it was designed as a safety net for underserved populations. But what's been happening, and there have been New York Times articles about this and everything, and I know Congress is parts of Congress are looking at this. The 340B program, the hospitals are now purchasing drugs really cheap and then raising the price by thousands of dollars, or up to 7 times, I think, their cost, and then selling them to most of the patients at a profit within the hospital system. So there's kind of a huge margins.
Is that why when you go to like a walk-in clinic and they now have their own pharmacies at these walk-in clinics?
It could be. I mean,
oh my God,
I'm not that familiar.
We're going to have to look into that, because that is, and I've known there's something going on there. I mean, like the last time I had this experience was when I had one of my hips replaced, and like a tile, because you can only get the opioid-based prescriptions every so often, but you can have a Tylenol in between. I'm pretty sure I have this right. So this is when I had my hip replaced, and it was a couple overnight stays back 12 years ago. And the Tylenol, it was something like $20 a pill for Tylenol. For one dose of Tylenol, it was like $40. And it's like, well, geez, that should be probably like a decade supply of Tylenol. Right? I mean, you could go to Costco and buy a gigantic bottle, maybe not a decade, but at least 4 or 5 years supply of Tylenol at Costco prices. And that's 2 pills.
Well, I mean, I think the main point I want to make on this, right? I mean, why are we talking about this here at IPWatchdog in an IP context? And again, like I don't know exactly the ins and outs of why, in your case, it's a fair example. You'd have to ask a drug pricing expert on that. But this is an IP story in a way, because whenever you're talking about price controls and cutting the price of drugs by going after the part that goes into the innovators' pockets, in order to drive the innovation, right, which is what the patent system is all about, you are taking away the incentives to keep investing in R&D. As it is, I mean, the statistics are only 20 to 30% of all drugs make a profit. I think I mentioned this earlier.
Right.
A lot of them don't. So when you're chipping away at that part of the supply, not the supply chain, that part of the drug development and the innovative pharmaceutical system, you're hurting the innovation, right? Which is what the IP side is all about. That's why I think it's important for the IP community to understand these other components of the pricing system.
Absolutely. Amen. Because it is so easy to say, and people believe patents just are the problem.
Right.
And they're not. They're just, when you peel the layers of the onion, patents are not why you're paying a lot of money for pharmaceuticals. It's just not.
Yep.
There are all kinds of other reasons. But as you know, because you're in this D.C. inside the Beltway bubble, which spills over into Maryland and Virginia. The ads that we see in our TV, patents kill. That's the ads that we were seeing all throughout COVID, and still you would see billboards, you'd see buses wrapped with, not like lawyer ads or sports team ads. It was patents kill, and coming out of the metro, there was signs, patents kill. It was all over the place because it's an easy story. It's wrong all day, but it's an easy bumper sticker.
Sure, and you're back to this, long-term, short-term. Even if that were true, which it's not, obviously, that came out in the context of COVID, right? The allegation was, well, because of patents, patients somewhere aren't getting vaccines. That's just false anyway. I mean, it was the best rollout, fastest rollout, most successful and broadest rollout of any vaccine in history. I think it was within 18 months. Something like 80-something% of the world's adults had gotten at least one dose within 18 months. Compare that to polio, where there's still patients who haven't gotten a shot.
No, I know, and it took forever for Salk. It took a decade for Salk to come out with it.
Sure,
they tested it for 2 years or some just to test.
Yeah.
To prove it before they,
But the patents kill thing is obviously ridiculous, because if it weren't for the patents, you wouldn't have any vaccine, and so it's the lack of patents is what would have killed in that case. But no, I mean, look, you're absolutely right. I think it's really important for people to understand, the role that patents play, and why if you go after that in order to to try to lower drug prices, you're really getting at the innovation. You're not addressing the parts of the system that really are benefiting financially but not contributing to the innovative medicines that everybody wants to see.
Right.
I do want to, quick, if you don't mind, talk about the international component of the most favored nation, because you're right. I mean, part of the other side of the equation, right? You can say that there are reasons why drugs spend is too high in the U.S., and that's these pieces we just talked about. But overseas, there's also, I think, the correct argument that other countries aren't paying enough. They're not paying a fair share. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including an IP component. There's also the direct price controls. There's, there are pricing systems that they purport to be valuing the drug based on its innovative value, but they're kind of biased formulations and equations that really discount the true value of the innovation, in our view. But then you get to also the IP restrictions, right? There are a lot of countries in the world, in fact, most of them, that don't offer or respect the level of IP that we have in this country. I'll give you an example. Like in much of the world, you still can't get patents on medical uses. Countries like a lot of Latin American countries, for example, you can't get any patents on medical uses. In countries like India, you can't get patents on new versions of old molecules very easily under something called Section 3D. A lot of countries use compulsory licenses or the threat of compulsory licenses to artificially deflate prices. No regulatory data protection in much of the world, no patent term extension or adjustment for delays in regulatory approval. All of these things, effectively, if you add them up, lead to what I'd say are premature generic entry in these markets, which of course is artificially going to lower the price. If generics enter unduly early, the price is going to go down because of price erosion, but also because these systems often have automatic price drops of the innovative drug, the on-patent drug, once a generic enters. Even in some cases, there are some markets where if a generic launches at risk and enters, once it enters, the price of the innovative medicine goes down, even if you eventually win in a court and prove patent infringement. So these are just examples of how weaker IP systems overseas also influence the prices overseas. Grace period's another one, by the way. We're the only country that really has a grace period. So in other countries, here in the U.S., of course, you have 1 year to file a patent application if you've published, new research that's patentable. Overseas, the second you publish it, you can't get a patent on that same invention anymore. So there's no patent there. So maybe drugs go generic earlier for that reason. And all of which is to say is, if you're then looking to the prices in these countries and you want to import those foreign prices under those weaker systems here, you're effectively importing a weaker IP system into the U.S. Right. In the form of an artificially lower price. And that's why, again, I did want to link it here because, I'm an IP person. This is an IP community, and you're an IP watchdog. And there really is an IP component to this. It's not really just a pricing discussion.
Absolutely an IP component to this. And it's, And it's about innovation. It's about how do we give those people who are creating some of the coolest innovations, and not only cool, but life-saving, life-altering, family-altering innovations, and here in the life sciences industry, and we've already talked about the cancer and the targeting cancer, and that will change the lives of so many people, just in ways that they'll never understand. They'll never understand what another Christmas with mom would have been like, or 5 or 10 more Christmases, and we have that ability, and I just feel like we're screwing it up. I'm all in favor of the most favored nation thing, because I think that what's going to wind up happening is I think it's going to force a lot of these conversations that we just had to the front. What's really the cause? And without like some kind of, in your face, well, look, we're just not going to do it anymore, because we all know we're going to do it. This is like we're not closing the pharmaceutical industry in the U.S. and you're not closing it internationally, but you do have to have, I think, that moment where it's like, okay, the way it's been done can't happen anymore. And for the first time, people are talking, because these PBMs have been in existence for 50 or 60 years. Yeah. The first time I heard about it was a couple of years ago. I didn't know that they existed. I didn't know. I kind of had this idea that there was somebody that wasn't the company deciding whether you can get that drug with your policy or not. But I didn't understand now that people are learning about this, I think it's shocking a lot of people. Absolutely. And the play from my perspective on IP is simply across the board in our area, the only people who are ever asked to suck up and deal, and you just have to take less, are the innovators, who none of this would happen without them. Right. It's the last group of people that should be told to suck up and deal, when not everybody, but so many other people throughout the entire process are just either committing fraud or, in the international context, ramming their version of price controls down our throats in the U.S. and causing us to pay more. And it's just not right, damn it. I feel like I want to sing the Twisted Sisters song, we're not going to take it anymore. That's what we need. We're not going to take it any more moment.
And I think we're effectively saying the same thing in different ways. I mean, we would say we don't like most favored nation because the version of that is still not clear what this administration supports, and that others like Bernie Sanders, have supported is just look at what other countries are paying under the status quo and adopt that price here. That is not a landing zone that we could accept for the reasons you just said, because it would completely undermine the ability to keep innovating at the levels we do. However, if you can address the reasons that are not on the cost of innovation in this country, like the ones we just talked about, PBMs, 340B, while also addressing, I think, the artificial ways that other countries underpay and don't actually compensate fair value for innovation, that is something we can support, addressing those two things. We just wouldn't really call it MFN, because MFN implies that you're happy with the price now overseas, and that's not okay. And I think you're saying the same thing.
No, I'm totally. I see it as a vehicle to get to where we need to go potentially. Right. And I shared with you privately that like the one thing that really worries me about the MFN stuff is that I could see it working as a vehicle to get to where I think you and I are in agreement, and restructure the market or the economy around this question, the pharmaceutical question. But if you're going to go down that path, you have to have staying power. And I don't know in America that we have the long view that gets us from here to there. Yeah. But and just to put a pin in it, just to be completely honest, the way I see it is, if we do have most favored nations, and that's sort of the flag that gets planted way out there on the one side for negotiating purposes, and there's fear that could come through to be, then the pharmaceutical industry has to stop selling outside the U.S. because you couldn't exist. You couldn't charge in the U.S. what Germany, for example, or the U.K. are willing to pay. You just there wouldn't be enough money.
Yeah.
The risk involved, because as I understand it, 10% of drugs make a lot of money, 10% make a little money, 10% barely break even, and 70% lose various degrees of lots of money. You know, so we're talking really about 10 to 12, 14% of drugs paying for the whole thing. You know, you can't take a huge cut out of what pays for everything. And still, so I see it as sort of like this, like Armageddon, like cliff. That we're going to go over a cliff. Sort of like the reason why most litigation doesn't settle until 11 p.m. or 12 p.m. on the night before they're going to select the jury.
Right.
That's what I see. And if that's what happens, I think we can get to a whole bunch of smart, sane people in the room saying, okay, well, we're going to get rid of PBMs or significantly cut back on PBMs. And you guys in Europe, for example, maybe Japan too, you know, like Korea, like the real industrial countries, you got to pay more. You just got to pay more. I don't think anybody really, I don't expect poor countries in Africa, poor countries in Latin and Central America to pay more.
Yeah.
You know, what I expect is the people who are rich overseas in those nations, you got to pay more because America is subsidizing, you know, even with the PBMs. Even if we do away with the PBMs, America would still be subsidizing the R&D for the whole world. And I'm just not okay with that. And if that makes me a bad person, then, you know, I'm a bad person.
No, I mean, I think it's understandable when others have the means to contribute, they should be contributing their fair share. I mean, whatever that is, I mean, people can figure that out. But right now, we agree. I mean, the share that many countries are paying is not where it should be.
Right. Well, you know, I'm looking at the clock. We've been talking a long time. I have no idea how long we've been going, but this was a great conversation. I really appreciate you being here. Before I let you go, though, is there anything else that you want to leave on? Maybe leave on a high note, or you know, plant a flag for a future conversation. Or the floor is yours. The microphone is yours.
Sure. No, I mean, the other thing we could talk about, but we don't have to do it today, is AI. What's going on there? You know, we are hopeful that we'll see some improvements in the AI-assisted inventorship guidance as one area. It's going to be interesting to watch. Another area, you know, what's going on with the copyright wars here, even though it's not our industry directly. Obviously, there are IP implications there of, you know, how much can copyrighted material be used. There are, I think, some trade secret implications there we can unpack at some point in the future. But a lot of really interesting issues as AI moves forward. It's raising all kinds of, again, fascinating and very, very important and timely IP questions, which I know we'll continue to explore. But
that's a good plug for our upcoming Life Sciences program in October 27, 28, 29. I know for sure we're going to talk about AI in drug development and discovery, and probably talk about it in terms of some of the other stuff that's going on too, as well. And I always like to talk about it. It's a sort of a slightly different conversation, one that we still haven't dealt with, I don't think, is what is AI going to do for patentability, not eligibility.
Yeah.
But I mean, are we going to live in a world where AI is allowed to make everything obvious? And we can't. We can't be there, but we haven't had that conversation yet.
I actually, this is my personal view. I don't think we're anywhere near that point in time. I think, for one thing, you know, you're going to look at hopefully you're going to look at obviousness human to human and not compare a human to a machine any more than you'd compare a human to a machine and how much dirt you can dig in 5 minutes. You know, versus a.
So I agree that's ultimately, I think, where we're going to have to land. I do think, though, that a lot of our people, I think, are missing how little we've developed obviousness since KSR.
Yeah.
And it's easy to say, oh, well, wait, that was 2007. You know, we're approaching 20 years. You know, that's 18 years ago. Of course the law's been developed. So, no, it hasn't. Because the areas where that would get the most development are areas where 101 has totally just kneecapped whole industries, whole avenues of innovation, both in the life sciences area and in the software area. And so I don't think we have any real idea of the potential tragedy of KSR.
Yeah.
Because once we get 101 sorted out, and we're finally seriously talking about that, we're probably at least 2 to 4 years away from that. But once we get 101 sorted out, a lot of these issues, some of them will go into 112, but a lot of them are going to go into 103. And then we're going to start to really see just how bad KSR is as a decision, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to end on a high note, I'm optimistic that the current law can evolve, right? I mean, we've had our patent laws for 230 years or something like that. I think they can evolve. I also happen to believe, in really the uniqueness of humanity. So I'm not too worried about AI doing everything, making everything obvious. In the sense, the analogy I like to use is music, right? There's 12 notes in the Western scale. How many countless, new songs are written all the time with just 12 possibilities, right? Combined in different ways. Is it theoretically possible that AI will sequence every conceivable possible song that can ever be written? Maybe there's the computing power to do that, but I still, have my doubts that it's going to displace, the amazing ingenuity that a real artist can do with just 12 possibilities. So I think applying that analogy to innovation as well, there's going to be things. I think AI has real limitations. By the way, we see this as really another quick aside if you want to keep going for 2 more minutes. There's some really interesting research about the use of AI in the legal field and what that actually does to the ability to lawyers and their ability to think. And some people are of the view that adopting AI in the legal field is going to be the end of lawyers because you're just going to have AI do all the brief writing, all the argumentation. The problem with that is, sure, you can have AI do a first draft of something and then someone can review it and make sure it's accurate. I mean, we have to fix that problem too because there's been like 120 odd, hallucinatory type, citations to fake cases in court, and you've seen all that. But the other side that people aren't thinking about enough is once you start going down that path, if you go down that path, you've got what's called path dependency, which is you're taking a first draft that was outsourced to some piece of software, and you're basically moving quickly from thinker and writer to editor, right? And yeah, you can do that for maybe run-of-the-mill simple legal tasks, but what you're losing there is the real, legal creativity, creative thinking, putting together ideas that maybe no one else saw before, thinking out of the box. That happens when you're the one coming up with the initial argument. And I think, again, that analogy can apply to all fields of human ingenuity and human thinking. We are a long way off from everything I understand and have read about, from computer scientists and talking to computer and data scientists. AI it's a misnomer in a way. It's not intelligence, right? I mean, it's an incredibly powerful, useful tool for efficiency and for proposing new things in certain areas, but I'm optimistic that there's a huge role for humans, for a long time.
Well, there has to be. I'll give you a quick, for instance, I just had this. So I'm wrapping up now. We teach during, people probably know for many years, for 25 years, I've been teaching a patent bar review course as a piece of what I do. And so in the new world, we don't actually go to rooms and do it anymore like we used to. It's almost all online. And one of the varieties of the course is every summer we do what we refer to as the office hours course. So you get an assignment, then you come and John White and I, we spend 2 hours once a week with them talking about what they should have gotten out of this and answering questions, right? So we're in the middle of doing this, and somebody asked a question, can you file a plant patent provisional application? So John was lecturing and I was just sitting there. So I decided, I don't know what made me decide to do this. I went to ChatGPT and I asked it. And then I went to Google and asked Google. Google got it right. ChatGPT got it wrong. Yeah. The answer is either yes or no, right? You got a 50-50 shot. And ChatGPT got it wrong. And not only did they get it wrong, like they were doubling down and you can't do this and you blah, blah. And I'm like, with a question to which there is a factual answer. One AI got it right and the other AI got it wrong. So we are so far away from AI replacing people.
Agreed.
We just are. Now, I think we can all see that world. I can see a world where we do need a John Connor. I probably won't be around then, but for right now, and I also, I know we've been going long. I'll end. This is my final thought.
Sure.
I would like to see governments spend more time trying to adopt Isaac Asimov's 3 rules for robots. And like the one that interests me the most is don't do humans any harm.
Yeah.
Right. And they're trying, like the EU's doing what they're doing in California, Colorado. A lot of states are starting to do, try and regulate AI. It's like, let's start with the ethics part. Don't kill humanity, or, require people to program in humans good. And until we're willing to have that conversation, I mean, and maybe it's just people like us. We grew up on Saturdays watching science fiction, and I still do. I feel like the people who are our legislatures never watched any science fiction, and it's disturbing.
Well, good science fiction always has some, I think, real life lessons and morals to look at. So, actually, Asimov's 3 rules of robotics have been looked at, as I understand it, from the AI and robotics community as kind of a self-regulating model. So it makes some sense to me, and I think don't kill humanity is a message. Hopefully, we can all agree to.
Yeah, we should probably end there.
Right.
Corey, it's been great. This has been a lot of fun. We'll have to have you come back again.
No, my pleasure. It was great. A lot of fun as well. I always appreciate the opportunity to be here. So thanks again.